specifically with individuals who are passionate about a certain technology, using that technology to solve a problem. The idea here is to give the audience kind of a really wide view of how some of these similar platforms may work, right? And so each one that presents up here is gonna, really highlight the things they like about the platform, hopefully be agnostic and tell you, the things that maybe suck about the platform, and all that good stuff. So just a fair warning, when I put this together, I thought, 15 minutes each, that should be pretty doable. I think we can cram all that in. If anybody goes over 15 minutes, cut them a little slack. This is a lot more dense than the other two styles we've done. We had done like a mobile hybrid framework shootout thing, and then we did a JavaScript framework one. And the CMS, if you're at all familiar, is going to be a lot more components to it. So we'll try and move swiftly, and speaking for myself, I know it's going to be really swift. So, sorry. So I've got... The first one we have here is the, there you go. The Adobe Experience Manager. And the presenter asked me to poll the audience if anybody's ever heard or worked with Adobe Experience Manager before. If you can hear me, there's 0. 1. Where's the 1? Oh, damn. Oh, okay. Okay, we got somebody that's heard of it. All right. So here we go. Can you give me a mic test?
Let me know when I can get started.
Yep. Good.
All right. So
hi everybody.
Hi everybody. My name's Besim. I'm sorry I couldn't make it down there. I just did a lot of traveling because I just got married. So last thing I want to do is do any more traveling right now. So with that said, I'm a technology specialist here at VMLYR in Kansas City. Before that, I worked for 40 Digits out of Springfield in Kansas City, and then I was with Barclay as well. Kind of started my development career in '99. Generally a front-end developer, and I started working with AM once I actually joined VML. Some of the big clients I've worked with are Sprint, Ford, Phillips 66, and Bridgestone Commercial, all of which have been AM, or Adobe Experience Manager. So I'll make it short. We're going to briefly look at what AM is intended to do, take a conceptual look at a basic installation, look at how AM stores data and renders websites, and then I'm going to conceptualize QuipVid as an AM site. Side note, before I even started this, I was not aware that I had to do the whole thing as an actual site, and this is a great example of why AM is not a good candidate to run QuipVid, essentially. And then I'm going to take a tour of some of the authoring experience via a local demo. So what is AM supposed to do? It's essentially a content management system that specializes mostly on marketing content and pages. It's best utilized to help make the management of dozens or hundreds of systems of engagement at large scale possible. So a lot of content pages. It's not going to be a good fit if you only have 5 or so pages or maybe one site. It makes more sense to use when it's a system of hundreds of sites. So if you have a brand and they have multiple sites, maybe in Argentina or Asia or wherever it may be, or maybe your site is also in English and several different languages. You can also fulfill a backend role, and that's primarily for maybe the content for a spa, your mobile applications, IoT devices, and it can also store records of data for your enterprise systems. So AM it's commercially supported. It's ran on a commercially supported implementation of a Java content repository, which is often referred to as JCR. And this JCR stores your content, assets, data, and whatnot. Site authoring GUI tools for creating sites and pages are used. These GUI tools manage, do pre-processing, and utilize assets like images, videos, documents, and whatnot. Additionally, you would have tools for activating, deactivating, publishing content, which I'll get into later. And then the render script system that's in use. It can represent the same content in many different ways. So whether it's an HTML, JSON output, text, thumbnails for images, for example, and the ability to extend to other alternatives. Some other features, you can have content tagging and indexing. So think of like literally tags and categories. There's internalization support as well as third-party vendor support. So translations.com and MotionPwn is something that we use in our sites. It also integrates with other Adobe products like Adobe Analytics, target personalization, dynamic media, and then there's Scene 7 Sensei, which I have not worked with. But when you buy into AEM, you're buying into the whole Adobe suite, essentially. One thing that I need to let everybody know is that AEM is not really an open source environment. There isn't a lot of open source plugins at all. It's just proprietary and it has a fairly small community with just enterprise clients. The two things that do exist that are open source are ACS Commons, and they have a core list of components which you can install. So if you're a small dev shop, you can use those to help you get it up and running. So some few terms that you should know once we get started. So JCR already kind of discussed that, which is a database of arbitrary, loosely structured or unstructured content. Then you have your run mode, which is basically the operation that the AEM instance runs in. You're typically going to have an author and publishing mode. Then you have the dispatcher, which is basically your web server, the file system based for content caching, and it also proxies requests to the publisher when a cache misses. Then you have a parsys, which is a major part of AEM. It's essentially includes on steroids. So you have a container that basically you drag components into or other content pieces. So your component then is a reusable authoring content piece. That's where you can, so think of it as a banner maybe, or a list of, I don't know, products. That's another thing. And so you just have a page, you drag a component on there, and that's how you do the authoring. Then you have the client library, which also referred to as client libs inside of AEM, but that usually consists of your JavaScript and CSS for distribution purposes. You have the templates, which is just your rendering of a page, and that's usually broken up into, you have your master template, and then you have some child templates that, maybe you have a general page, and then you have one for a search or a product detail and stuff like that. And then replication, which is for copying data and content from author to publisher instances. So your basic parts of installation is you have your author instance. That's where your authors come in, they interact with the content, they create content, and that content, once it's ready, it gets pushed up to the publisher, which is essentially your live production. And then you have the dispatcher, which comes in between the publish and the end user, essentially. So you're trying to minimize as much as possible. You're trying to minimize live hits, essentially. So this would be like a high-level overview. You'll notice that AEM author and an AEM publisher have a lot of dollar symbols below it, and that's because they're on 6 figures. And all of these licensing costs are negotiated between the client and Adobe, essentially. We just know the rumors. We never know what the actual cost is, but it can be anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000 just for one AEM instance to run it. So typically, you would actually have a local install, which you can run for free. You just run a Java package on your computer, and it spins up AEM, and that's how you can download content, and you can do development locally. And then usually you push it up to an author instance. That's where it's your dev environment, essentially, and gets built there. Authors can test and stuff like that. And then from there, you go into a stage or production. And then after that, you have the dispatcher, which creates all the static HTML pages, essentially. And you have a CDN after that, and then it goes into the client's web browsers. Or your apps can consume it as well that way. So just a few points. Multiple server instances. It's not just one. Each server instance of AEM has its own duplicate copy of the JCR database. So that's a Java content repository. So when you sync content from low to high or high to low environments, you have to create packages and install those on your environment. So it runs into 6 figures. It's very expensive. So you want to run a web server dispatcher so you can leverage and reduce your, you want to scale horizontally so you can incur much lower relative costs. So that's where Varnish or Akamai comes in. And then for any of your non-CMS applications, so like if you're doing form processing or search, you're going to have to offload that to a less expensive external app. And that's just because AEM isn't built to handle a lot of form processing or even hold user registrations, for example, or any other data that any other CMS could potentially handle. This is what a typical HTTP request sequence would look like. So you go to browser CDN. If the CDN fails, it'll go to mod dispatcher where it'll generate everything. And then if that fails, it goes to the publisher, renders everything. And you don't want it to go to the publisher unless you really have to. So the CRXDE, which is essentially your MySQL workbench, when you run AEM locally, you'll be able to access this, and I'll show you what this looks like. And that's where all of your data is broken up into nodes. And each, unlike, say, like MySQL, would have an ID, actually, that's like an ID that's associated with IDs that are associated with records, essentially. Whereas within AEM or CRXD, you would actually have absolute paths to the node. That would be the record ID. So you wouldn't be able to just be able to pull something based off an ID within AEM. There are many different types of node types. So some are just for folders, others are just for assets, handling like content. And your node type will dictate how it behaves, essentially. All of your content is actually within the JCR like the system. So when I create like my client libraries, they actually get uploaded to the JCR, and everything AEM will do some of the minification and concatenations and whatever it may be if I have several different libraries being loaded on one page. But we don't typically do that just because there are better ways of handling that these days. And then your node trees can be serialized, so that's usually XML, and that's how everything's written for us in our code. We write XML for a lot of the components, and I'll show you an example of that as well. So when you're interacting with the content in the JCR, it's all done through a REST API called Sling. If you go to sling.apache.org, there's some additional information on how that handles. In the GUI, it's a browser-based application, so when you're in authoring mode, a lot of the requests when you're trying to edit a component or page, it's all handled through the Sling REST API. And then all of your requests that you make there should be GET requests, so they execute the scripts, the rendered markup, and assets and whatnot. So if we actually were to do the Quipvet site as an AEM site, well, need user management, we can't do that. So we have to offload that to a third-party thing. So right now when I'm working on Bridgestone, we actually use SAP Hybris. So if we hook up into that through authentication-based system, so whatever that may be, that depends on you. I mean, you could, if you want to, you can have a flat file management somewhere else hosted and just access it that way. So for your video source files, if it was a smaller site, you could host everything within the DAM, which is the asset management system within AEM. So you just upload your files there, images, videos, and you can serve them that way. The downside to that is when you create packages, it can get really large in size. So your best option there would be just upload everything through a CDN. All your content pages, like your homepage, your content, or any other marketing, you would actually handle within AEM. If you were to do search, there are a couple ways of doing that. Right now, for example, in Bridgestone, what we're doing is Bridgestone has a separate API, and we access that API, and we actually we have Jenkins set up where it creates nodes within our authoring instances. And so like if I have a bunch of locations, we separate those locations based on country, state, city, and then we have, for each location, we have nodes then for telephone number and whatnot. And we can use Solr to index everything, and through the front end, through I don't know, if you want to use Vue or any other SPA framework, you can use that to hit up API requests, and that's how you would generate pages. And for detailed pages, or if you wanted to actually, like if you have a product, for example, or a location detail page, we can run Java servlets and get that content from that specific node, and we would have static HTML pages out. For video listing and detail, for example, you could, again, do the same thing where you use Solr to get all your data, or for searching purposes, or you can create an API based on however you handle user management, and we can do the same thing with videos. And in most instances, you would have to hit up an API to get your results back through a front-end framework. So AM wouldn't even be doing anything other than creating a component that would act as your render div, essentially. So I want to show you some examples of what AM looks like in a backend. I actually have a lot of this disabled just because I didn't want to. I can't show you what Bridgestone Commercial looks like right now. But when you log into AM, it might look like this. And for example, if I go to my sites, these are different sites. I can go to my commercial, Bridgestone, and I have a site created for Springfield. If I go and edit that, it's blank right now. You would have a header and a footer at the bottom, and inside of that, I had created a main container, which this is my include system parses basically. So inside of that, I can drag components that I've made, and the great thing about this is that depending on which template I use, I have they're called policies, and I can say, okay, these 4 components only work on this template, and these other 3 work on only this other template. So an author can only use whatever is specified for them. So here's a component that I created. It's used for my section, it's for grouping of content. If I modify it, this is what like a dialog, GUI dialog would look like. So I have a bunch of options defined for creating and setting everything up, but I'll just make this simple. I'll set a background color here, and I'll save out of that. And one moment. And I'll actually set a container size. And then I can drag, I have another container inside of that where I can drag additional components, which I have defined what's allowed. So I'll drag a text component, and let me just copy some lorem ipsum for you guys. So there it is. It's a simple text view. And within AM, there's little columns, responsive columns that I can define. So this is a desktop view. I'm basically telling it to take X amount width, and then for mobile or tablet, I can do the same thing. It's just going to copy this. But if I want to do another component, let me do something. I'll just do another text. So it's taking up the full width, but I can resize this. And because I'm using Flexbox in this setup, they're all going to line up. And yeah, so that's like the gist of it. And then when I previewed this page, actually, this is what it would look like. I inspected, and AM tends to add a lot of markup. So AM's responsive grid, you'll see something called AM-grid. That's their responsive grid. That's part of all the components. They that's how they handle everything. And then my component that I have is the section grouping. It's included over here. And then again, AM tends to add a lot of their own responsive grid classes. But to show you what the markup would look like, so inside AM, I would have my client libs folder, and I'm creating these folder structures. And so like I have so AM supports component level client libs, but that doesn't always work out just because they end up injecting your JavaScript and CSS inside of the page, which is not a really great practice. So what we end up doing, we just break up stuff based on sections, or in this example, I have a main config file, which is just broken into my CSS. And so basically, I have a CSS.txt file in each folder. That just references my CSS that's being built out. And then AM is able to read that and generate a client library, essentially. And same thing for JavaScript. For a component, for example, like if I go to section grouping, so when I create a component inside of that, so we version our older components. So if somebody were to use this component, they can stick with the version 1. But if I decide to do another update, I can do a version 2, and they won't have any breaking issues, for example, on their site. But inside of that, there is a content.xml file, which basically you can define a component group, how it belongs to, and there are several like XML attributes that you have to populate, and they define how the folder structure would behave, for example. So this indicates that this is a component, and then there's a dialog folder, which you can see CQ_dialog. When I open that up, there's another XML file in there, and this is what it would look like creating fields. It's not that great. It can get confusing sometimes. AM uses they use something called Coral UI, which, as you can see, let me find one field. So, like I have a container size field. I defined a type, what the resource type is in, which is in like a button group, or I can do an input field, and then and then these are my options inside of the items. So it's a bunch of XML I have to write to create these components. So if I go and edit my component, this is what ends up happening. So I can group my stuff based on display, alignment, for example. All of this stuff I have created, and I can pull those values inside of my template, which is. So you can use something called Sightly, which is their templating language. So this is what it would look like. You'll have often something called data select test, where you're doing tests whether something exists and show and hide. And you're writing essentially a lot of something similar to almost handlebars, but it's called Sightly. That's their templating language. You can also write Java if need be, but we all write just Sightly with. Yeah, that's basically about it when it comes to AM. There's so much that needs to go into it, but there's just not enough time to cover everything, essentially. That's about it.
Hey Besim, thanks man. I'm gonna close out of this app to free up my machine.
If you guys have questions, hit me up on SGF Web Devs. There's a lot I can help answer if you guys have questions on.
Totally. Thanks, man. Okay, so that one ran a little long. So the three of the rest of us are going to try even harder to hit the time frame.
7 minutes, go.
So just FYI, if time is a thing for you and you have to leave, just get up and leave. Don't worry about interrupting anything. Having said that, I am going to fly extremely fast here. It's going to be quite a bit different presentation. So sorry if it hit you like a ton of bricks. We can chat afterwards if anything entices you. But yeah, this is gonna be fast. So, obligatory description. Umbraco is a fully featured open source content management system. Flexibility, blah 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 blah. Right. So seriously though, what is Umbraco about? So the awesome side of it, IMO, is the .NET stack. I love C#, I love .NET, so I love that aspect of it. The unobtrusiveness and flexibility of this platform is really nice. So the story is data in, right? It's a content management system, manage the content, and then you construct your views, your markup and whatever really easily. So like, time to throw shade here. The markup that came out of AEM, garbage, right? Like that stuff pisses me off to no end. So that's kind of what that unobtrusiveness means, right? You have complete control over your markup. Throwing shade again, $200,000 or $1 million, out of control, right? So free and open source. Obviously, these are very different platforms. AEM is going to have its place. This is totally different, okay? So free and open source. Easy for devs to develop in, designers to design in, and users to edit content in. The not awesome, right? The .NET stack, right? So, like, you may hate it, and I don't blame you, right? So, like, previously, a big thing is if you're going to do .NET work, it was going to be on Windows, right? I hate the Windows operating system, so that's bullet number 2 on here. Unfortunately, so .NET has evolved, right? We got .NET Core now, which runs on various platforms. Runs on Mac, runs on Linux. You can host it on a Linux server. Like, that story is becoming awesome. However, currently with Umbraco, it is still running on an older version of .NET. It's not on .NET Core, it's on .NET 4.5. And so, which brings to the next point, hosting is quite a bit different. You cannot host this type of solution on a commodity $5 a month Linux box, right? It's just not going to work that way. At bare minimum, you're looking at spending like $20 a month plus, to run this type of solution on a server. So, it's not 200,000, but it's not $5 hairs either. Terminology. I had originally intended on going through these because they are kind of really important tenets of this platform. However, I'm gonna make the assumption that we can kind of roll with these concepts, so I'm gonna touch them really quick. Nodes. When we get into Umbraco, you're going to see that every piece of content that is entered into the system, those are referred to as nodes. We're going to leave it there. Document types. So when you create a piece of content, i.e. a node, it is going to be of a certain document type. A really good example here would be like a product, right? So if you've got an e-commerce store, you got a product, so like document type is going to be product. That brings us to properties and data types. So a property on a product could be something like name, price, image, right? And your data type is going to be what that property is. So a name is going to be a text string data type, as Umbraco will refer to it. An image is going to be, for example, another Umbraco data type is media picker. So that's kind of the type of your property. Yeah? Okay, cool. Demo time. Sit with the slides, right? A few more slides. I'm going to faux demo the installation process. A lot of different ways to install Umbraco. My favorite is just popping open Visual Studio, File, New Project. You select an ASP.NET web application, you give it a name, a location where you're going to store it. Framework, yep. The next step is, what do you want in your project? Well, this is going to be an empty one because the next step is going to be to NuGet install Umbraco. So NuGet, for those of you that are not familiar with .NET, is effectively NPM, right? So it's a dependency that you're going to go out and fetch, install in here. It's going to wire up a bunch of stuff, and away you go. So, I mean, it is as easy as dependencies, Umbraco CMS, you install it, and then this is what gets presented to you after you're done, with the very specific note there on line 12 of don't forget to build. And then it's just kind of a short README after that. If you've used Visual Studio before, you'll know this. If not, I like to use IIS instead of debugging directly inside of Visual Studio. So in Visual Studio, you can hit, debug, and it'll pop it up and just run everything there in an instance of a web server. I like to put my stuff in a local web server, so that's all I did here. Just wanted to give you an FYI. Basically point at a directory, give it a host name. That host name right there, local.myke.xyz, totally free to use. It points to 127.0.0.1, so, and it's wildcarded, so you can make it whatever you want. Free to use. Just FYI. Once you have it up, here's your install screen. So name, email, password. We're all about security here. Hit customize almost all the time. This is a machine key, but just continue, whatever. Database type. You can install on several different databases. For this demo, we are using SQL Server Compact. It's just a file that you can kind of transfer around with your install. But you can point it at a full-throated, SQL Server, MySQL, a couple of other different options. Last but not least, the no thanks, I don't want to install a starter website. By default, it will install starter content in there for you. So if this is the first time you're doing it, you may like that because you can kind of poke around and see. It kind of gives you a really typical website setup. However, once you've used it more than once and you're using it for a real project, you probably don't want any of that in there. So then you get to the install screen, it runs for about a minute, and then boom, it pops you in the back end, which is technically referred to as the Umbraco back office. And this is where all of the content management in the system happens. Now I'm going to reset and get into code mode. This is going to be nuts. I realized that I failed to talk about what the hell QuipVid is. Some of you will be familiar with this, others of you definitely not. So QuipVid is a passion project of mine, and a few people helped me put together. It is all about quotes, movie quotes, TV show quotes. That's what it is, right? So, if you like Seinfeld. So the idea is that you can send these around. If you send it in a text message, it'll embed in there. You can play. If you put it on social media, it'll embed, play, blah, blah, blah. It all came as a love of mine from talking in movie quotes, basically. And YouTube wasn't cutting it for me, and whatever. It's probably slightly illegal and everything else. So this is reared its head a number of times because it's a small enough project and tangible enough that it's fun. And then makes sense, right? So we have a structure of a collection of quips, and then you have the quip itself, which basically has a name. It has an association to some sort of movie or show. It has a video. It has a poster image. And that's about it, right? So it's nice and easy to grok, and so we've used it several times in here as kind of a thing to do stuff in. So the mobile shootout we did, it did the same concept. So that's QuipVid, for those of you that were wondering what on earth that is. So I'm going to bring it back up here again. The idea is to rebuild this as close as possible to its final form in our chosen platform. So unfortunately, you didn't get to see much of that from Besim, but I do believe that from the rest of the presentations, we will see a pretty true form of rebuilding this. So with that, let me reset my mind here, because we're going to start building. And I'm going to fat finger everything, and it's going to be awesome. So this is right where we left off in those images. Fresh install here, and we're ready to rock and roll. So the very first thing we need to do in here, and I'm going to try and enlarge this as much as possible. First thing we're going to do here is create those document types. So again, I'm sorry that there's a little lack of foundational information here. So just kind of roll with it here. Your document types, you have a few different options here. You can create just a document type, one without a template. Think of a template as your HTML, your markup. So you might have one that is just data representation. You don't need it to have any sort of view representation, right? And then we got a new one here called document type collection. This was created because a very standard practice was when you're creating something like we are now, quips, where you have a collection of something and then children inside of that, you always kind of ended up creating this hierarchy of quips, quip, right? Or products, product. And so this kind of made it a lot easier, so you don't have to take those two steps manually. So you create the parent type here, quips, and then the item itself is a quip, and we're going to hit create. This will take a hot second. By default, sorry, rewind. Two things here. We're going to mainly be focusing on this settings section up here and content. So think of this as we're creating our data structure and then we're adding content. Over here in our content tree, it's empty on the left here. So in our settings, not going to go into too much detail here, but under permissions, we're going to allow the quips to be created at the root. One thing that's really nice about Umbraco is it allows you to direct your users in their content creation. Which means that you can dictate what they can create where. So imagine creating some sort of product data type under like a contact page. Doesn't really make sense, right? Like you want to be able to guide them where it's going. And so on that note, allow it root only allows you to create certain things at the root of the project. And then down here, allow child nodes. This was done because we created that collection. The child node types is quip. So we can say that quips can only have quip as a child. You can't create other things under it. Or if you wanted to, right, add child, you can tell it what kind of pieces of content can exist under that. So kind of cool. Save that. Should have saved it as I was rambling. So when we come to content now, we kind of got this ellipses over here, and then we can also right click. So same thing. When I right click on this, you see your contextual options. So create content, we have nothing in here yet. And so now this is telling me the only thing I can create here is a collection of quips, right? So I know this is a little bit weird. I'm going to call this home because if we come over here and look at QuipVid, the home page is effectively a collection of quips, right? So I'm just kind of shortcutting it here and doing this. So I'm going to save and publish. I'm going to open this and see the hotness. Yeah. Nothing, right? Blank site. We didn't install anything. Yeah, awesome. So before we start getting into the views, we're going to go ahead and just start stubbing out our data and adding some content. So now we're going to go to the quip document type. Here we go. I'm going to create, this is a groupings of properties basically. So I just by default like to call it content. So if I add a property here and I call it title, I can give it a description of a movie or show title, and then I add an editor. I'm going to fly through some of this stuff. I'm going to use an existing document type, and I'm just going to call it a text string. I'm going to say the field is mandatory. I'm going to add that. I'm going to also do an image. I'm going to add an editor, use existing. It's going to be a media picker, also mandatory. I'm going to add a final one here called video. Also a media picker, also mandatory. So here's kind of our properties that make up a quip, right? The bare essentials at the very least. Document type saved. I'm going to come back to content now. So under home, when I right click and go to create, it's going to show me what I can create under this. And so as we know, that's going to be a quip. So as I do that, I've got those fields that I added. Okay. So I'm just going to take a few of these. Let's not get into panic mode. The title is going to be Seinfeld. The image. So I'm flying, I know. This media picker, if you have media in your library already, it will show up right here. However, if you don't, you can hit upload. And I've got a number of these things at the ready. So I'm just going to upload all of them. Uploads all that stuff, shows them to you. So panic, oops, I don't want to edit the image. Select the image and then select the video. Save, publish. Boom, we have our content for that. Let's create just a couple more. Quip. I'm going to grab eating a scab. Any Breaking Bad fans? Haha. Do you remember this scene? It's kind of it kind of flies under the radar, but we'll watch it here in a little bit. I know some of these words. Good burger. Anybody remember that? Good burger image. Yep. I think I selected all the right things there. Is that tracking so far? I mean, we're just creating content, right? I click on home, I can see my content over here. There's a couple of different views. You can view it in like a list view. You can customize these views. You know, this is for your admins. So if they're internal admins, they don't really need anything saucy. Like you can just give them this. But like if it's a client of yours and you really need to kind of dress it up, you can go ham on this thing and do all sorts. So that's our data. So now we're going to jump into kind of the views side of this and see what it looks like to work with some of the templating and how you actually display this content out to the screen. Because remember, right now all we have is a blank screen. So I'm going to do a couple of things here real quick. Make sure I've got everything. Okay, so I have scraped that CSS, JavaScript, anything off of the QuitVid site. Just dumping it in here. We're not going to worry about doing any of that junk. And I've also got a number of snippets here. So let's just pop open old Visual Studio here. I'll make this a little bigger. Okay, so I did stub one of these things out already. So if you've not used .NET or C# or anything like that before, there's one really awesome aspect that I love, and it's working with your views like this and using the Razor template engine. If you've used Laravel and know what Blade is, it was heavily inspired by what Razor is doing. So it's really cool stuff. So the only two things I want you to focus on here, or take notice of rather, is this render section header and this render body. So this is kind of the core markup, right? I've got my head declaration up here. I've got analytics triggering and the navigation and just some stuff in here. And then I've got this render body tag. So what we're going to see here in just a moment is the quip or quips template that was generated. It'll be an empty file. We're going to set it to use this master template. And so here, I'll just show you. 1 second. I'm including these in the project. They were created behind the scenes, and these old school .NET projects are lame and you have to like manually include stuff. So we'll open the quips here. Come on, there we go. So you see that okay? Ish. I'm gonna go bigger. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to tell it to use this master page right here. And if I go look at the site again and refresh it, so you see that main portion of it coming through. And so where that render body starts to come into play now is anything that I put in. Anything that I put in here will automatically get injected into that render body. So when you see shit WordPress coming up and you have to like include the WP header, WP footer, WP sidebar, like all this stuff, it's kind of the inverse of that. So you're using a template and injecting into it, so you don't have to like stack it with the other things around it. It goes and injects inside of it. So pretty cool. And hell, who knows? There's probably Twig stuff in WordPress now, and who knows. Anyways, sorry, Charlie. Okay, so I'm just gonna grab some HTMLs and paste this in here. This is how my thought process works. I don't know if it's gonna track with y'all, but I kind of like to get the skeleton of stuff in there. And once I know that that's in there and you can prove the concept that you're looping around data, putting the like touches in there of, you know, like the title and images and stuff like that is cake, right? So I always kind of like to get the skeleton in there and just kind of keep stepping along. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're tracking pretty well here, this latest quips. We've got this header that we're missing and what have you. But here's the part that we want to loop over. So at the top, I'm just going to set up this variable called all quips, and this gets into stuff that's a little bit out of scope, but you can kind of see how this works a little bit. This view is strongly typed, and so we know based on this up here that we've got this is a collection of quips. It knows where it's at in the system. We've told it what type of content that it is expecting, and we access that through this model keyword there. So when I say model dot children, and I'm going to tell it that I want children of type quip, what this is going to do is, like I said, it knows where it's at in that content tree. It's going to look for all of its children underneath of it that are of type quip and put these in a list that we can loop over. So with this markup down here, gonna for each over the all quips, paste, come back over here and just make sure that we're getting this stubbed out version 3 times, right? We put 3 quips in there, so we expect to get those 3. Awesome, we know we're getting access to our data. So then from here on, we know that we have access to quip, and some of these things are going to be Umbraco specific. So that URL you'll learn is just, a field that you have access to. So quip.url, and then in this quip name, I'm going to do quip.name, and then the image, right? So quip. This is coming up nice, right? So like image dot, like what do I have access to on here? I can get all sorts of stuff. I just want the URL of that image, right? We'll refresh. Yeah, there's stuff. Woo! We won't worry about that header content for the interest of time, but know that razor sections and stuff are super cool. So over here, when we click on eating a scab, blank page, right? Kind of the same process we need to go through here then. If we look at this quip view that was generated for us, again, it's blank. It's just got the bare necessities in there. And so we'll kind of do the same thing. We'll tell it that's your template. So we'll just make sure this is working and that we get something going. Yep. And then I've got another snippet here. This one's a little bit thicker, but all the same concepts. So I'm going to paste this and incremental checking, make sure that stuff's generally working. All right, there's our skeleton. There's all the things we're expecting to work with. So if you're a back-end engineer and don't do any front-end, like your front-end developer is going to deliver this over to you, and now it's time for you to go in and wire all this stuff up, right? So we'll start here with model.video.url. That's a media picker there. The poster, we're going to do, model.image.url. It's good there. Kind of keep scrolling to see what I've missed. Quip name, model.name. This stuff is just metadata. We're going to ignore it. Model.title. There's the title. I got some schema.org stuff in there. View counts. We're not going to worry about that tonight. Creator name. We do have access to that because remember I put my name in there when we installed, and so I was logged in as that user. It knows the creator name. It's an Umbraco thing. Interesting thing here, the share URL is an absolute URL, so you want that to include your domain name and your protocol and everything. So we'll do model.url, and this one actually has a little funny mode argument, and URL mode.absolute. You usually can just do URL. Here's another little funny thing. The embed URL is slightly different structure, and so it just has this, basically it's wanting its slug, its last part of the URL here, so you can say model.url segment. It'll basically leave off the slash at the beginning. Let's make sure we're working.
Hell yeah, start for this lasagna, and then you nuke it, and cheese gets all scabby on top, and it's like you're eating a scab.
Jesse Pinkman. So we got our video, of course. We got the name right there, the show title, the author, and then lastly, this is just the last thing I'm going to touch on here. Very similar to how we wanted all of those quips. We're going to say all quips equal, oh boy. We're going to say model. So before we did children, because it was the parent and it wanted the children. Now we're actually on a quip, so we're actually going to say siblings, because it wants it on the same level, right? So we'll grab siblings of type quip, and this actually does something weird. It doesn't type it as quip. We'll see in a second, but whatever. So we can usually, if you are copying and pasting stuff like this, you got a little smell, and you know you're going to want to, probably put that in a partial and reuse it, but whatever, we don't have time. And then it barks at one thing over here. Image in this instance is the only property that is not an Umbraco inherent property. URL and name are default, so it knows that. But this image is one that we created, and for whatever reason that siblings call types it as the standard type as opposed to quip. So if we just forcefully tell it it's a quip there, it's good. And if we refresh,
Hell yeah,
we can click through.
I know some of these words.
And the last one here. So you can see everything's populating. We're able to loop through stuff. That's the end of my presentation. Levi's next. If there is any questions, I'm happy to take them as he's setting up. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is my phone up there?
Over on time.
A lot. Okay. So, it's my turn to shit on WordPress. Just kidding, I won't make fun of WordPress too much. I feel like Charlie's going to roast us all somehow.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm here representing Kraft CMS. Who here has heard of Kraft? Who here has used Kraft? Right on, there's a few people here. Okay, so I've used a handful of CMSs in my day. By far, Kraft is my favorite. At the end of the day, Kraft is a very flexible content management system that does its best to provide the best developer experience alongside the best content editing experience. And in my opinion, Kraft has done an excellent job of striking a balance between those two concerns. So, I also wanted to mention that, just like Myke mentioned with Umbraco, it's completely unobtrusive. So that means it provides essentially no markup for you at all. You are in complete control of the templating side of things. You are also in complete control of the content model alongside with Umbraco here. You know, systems like WordPress are going to come with the assumptions that you're running a blog or something like that. Kraft provides none of that. A real quick technical overview. Kraft CMS is built on top of PHP, just like WordPress. But on the flip side, Kraft really embraces some modern PHP development tools. So you install Kraft using Composer, which is the package manager for PHP. You install plugins for Kraft using Composer and manage their versions using your Composer file. And then also, kind of the most important part of almost any of these CMSs we're using tonight is the templating side of things. So Kraft uses an open source templating language pulled from the Symfony PHP framework called Twig. It is not proprietary to Kraft, which is a big plus in my opinion. Real quick, wanted to run through a feature list of some reasons maybe to choose Kraft over other content management systems. So out of the box, it comes with no opinions on content model, and so that assumes that it has some sort of custom fields feature. So you create the various fields for your content, and you piece these fields together to create a content model. It has built-in support for localization, so handling multiple versions of content in other languages. Built-in support has built-in multi-site support, so if you need to manage like a sister site with relatively maybe some of the same content, some different, and maybe a different skin, it can handle that out of the box. It has built-in asset management, has a really, really good asset manager, a lot like Umbraco's media library. Has like a built-in image editor. This is one of those things that it does a really good job of for the content editors. They don't have to keep Photoshop open on their computer if they need to quickly crop an image on your website. It has built-in image transforms, which I'm also a really big fan of. So a content editor can upload a high-resolution version of an image, and in your code, you specify the actual resolution that you want to be output for the specific view. And Kraft worries about generating the version of that image for you. Probably one of Kraft's biggest pluses, and it gets a lot of praise for, is its live preview feature. So as someone is editing content in Kraft, there's a live preview button where they can see a live version of the site and their content on the left, and as they make changes to the content on the left, the live preview will automatically reload to show those changes, which is really handy. Something not really many people have mentioned, it was kind of mentioned in the AEM presentation, was what does Kraft like to use if it's powering a mobile app? There are plugins in the plugin store that can automatically build a GraphQL API based on your content model. So that's also available in Kraft. So jumping in and taking a look at Kraft itself, this is a brand new Kraft install with a couple of things set up out of the box. By default, Kraft has almost nothing in this sidebar here, mainly just the dashboard, utilities, and settings in the plugin store. The rest of this shows up because I've added a handful of things in. So everything starts by going into settings and starting to set up what your content looks like. And the first place to start is in sections. So before I talk about sections, I need to talk about what Kraft considers a piece of content. So in Umbraco, that each piece of content was considered a node. You can kind of take that same conceptual model in Kraft, only it's called an entry. So every type of content, whether that's a blog post or in our situation, a quip, that is called an entry. And entries belong to sections. So you create a section for each kind of type of entry. So in a blog, you might have a blog section that contained blog posts or blog entries. So for us, we're going to have a quips section that contains each individual quip. To create a section, you come in here, create a brand new one. By default, this is kind of the screen you would see, or you give it a name, and then you give this a handle, and you'll see this in a few places. This handle is how you will refer to this section or whatever it is you're creating in code. So usually this would be like maybe a camel case version of the name, which it'll automatically generate for you. Then you can also give the section a URL format. So what this is going to automatically do is whenever a request comes in that matches this format, Kraft is going to automatically pull this content out of the database, and then it'll render this template, which this is just a file in a folder called templates with either a .html or a .twig extension, and it'll render that file and pass it the data. And then right here, there's a little bit of templating happening in the URL itself, where it's outputting the slug field. So by default, every entry has at least a slug field, which is guaranteed to be unique, and you can use that inside of this URL format to decide what the URL should look like. So once you create a section, this entries piece will appear here with the section you created. You can go in there and start adding new entries. But before you do that, you also want to start to define what some of the content for this entry looks like. And to do that, we have to create these custom fields that I mentioned earlier. So to start creating a custom field, which I've already set all of the basic fields for a quip up, except for the views field. So I'm going to create a new field for views specifically and attach it to our entry. So we come in here to fields. I have a handful of them already created, and I'll get into more of what these mean in a minute. But if I go ahead and create a new field, I'll call it views, and you can see it automatically generated a handle. So this is how we'll refer to this field in code. We can provide some instructions for the content editor. I'm going to skip over most of this. The other important part is this field type. So by default, Kraft has a whole bunch of different field types. You can have an asset field, an email field, dropdown, etc. For a views field in particular, we would want it to be an integer value. So I'll select number here. And then the options below it change. They are contextual to the type of field you're creating. One thing that I'll mention is by default, there is no rich text field in Kraft. Kraft actually hands that off to a third-party plugin. which they actually provide a first-party plugin if you want to use their recommended one, but you can install whatever rich text editor you want to use for or that your content editors want to use. And so that's why there's no rich text field built in. So I'll select number, I'll go ahead and click save. And then the next thing to do once you've created a field is then to go attach that field to your entry type. So entries, once again, live inside of sections, but you can actually have different variations of those entries within a specific section. Not going to dive too deep into this, but maybe think something along the lines of a news post in your blog versus a webinar post or something like that. You could represent those with different entry types, and you can also have different fields depending on the entry type. Once again, not going to dive too deep there, but if I go into settings, sections, edit entry type, and by default it just creates an entry type with the name of the section. Here, this is an editor that shows me the available fields that I've created here, and then the fields that I've already attached to this entry type here. And you'll see why the things are kind of grouped separately. Those show up as separate tabs in the editor. But by default for views, I'm going to add it to this imported content tab. The reason I'm adding this is I'm going to automatically import all of the content from the QuipVid API, so we'll have all 500 plus videos to work with as data. The reason that you'll see like there's an image field versus an imported image field, I don't actually own any of the images that are on QuipVid. They're all in an S3 bucket. So instead of trying to actually do the extra work to import them into Kraft's own image field type, I'm going to just put them in a plain text field I've called imported image. And then my templating has some conditionals in there. So if someone has selected an image manually, it'll use that. Otherwise, it'll fall back to the imported image. Views is also something I don't want content editors to necessarily edit, so I've kind of set it off aside into this imported content since it'll come from the API. So I'll go ahead and save this, and then we'll go to entries, create a new entry in the Quip section, and here we're presented with all of those fields that I had added. On the sidebar here, these are all the built-in fields for every single entry. So by default, every entry has a post date, a slug, whether or not it's enabled or not. And also every entry, something I forgot to mention, every entry by default has a title at least. And that title you can either use in your templating, or the other place it's used is when displaying a list of these in the actual CMS. So I'm not going to create a QuipVid because we're going to import all those in a second. But also I wanted to show those groupings show up as separate tabs for my content here in the UI. So now I think the next part is to start importing data since we have all the fields here. So Kraft provides a first-party plugin called FeedMe that you can use to import data from essentially any source. So I'm going to come in here and create a brand new feed, and you can also set these to like run on a cron and just import data nightly or hourly or something like that. So I'll call this Quips feed, and let me open up some notes here. This is the API endpoint for all of the Quips. And I know that this is a JSON API, so I'll select JSON API format, and I want to import all of these essentially items into entries in Kraft, and I want to import those into the Quips section, specifically the Quips entry type. And for import strategy, you can have it like, delete missing elements or whatever. I'll select both of these, so if we ran this again and some data had updated like the view count, that would automatically just update existing records instead of deleting anything. So we'll go ahead and save. Right here, we're selecting the primary element. So what Kraft has actually done here, or this plugin, is it's made a request to the API, and by default, I think it's just a big JSON array, and the root element in that array is what we have selected right here. If this was maybe a more complex XML structure, this dropdown might have a few other things for us to select in here. But I'll go ahead and click Save and Continue to get to the last portion. And right here, on the left, we have all of our fields from our entry type, and on the right is a dropdown for each where we select a field from the API. So the title, that is going to be the name of the video. The slug is going to be the ID that is set in there, because that's how QuipVid actually has its URLs formatted. I'm going to skip most of the rest of this stuff. The show title I'm going to import from name. I'm going to skip image and video and instead import those directly into this imported image and video.
The show title's going to be title.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry. Thanks for catching that. Yeah, okay. The rest of that's right. Good point. And then lastly, the views. So come down here. I'm also going to make sure the slug is really the only thing that I want to be unique. There could be, multiple quips that have the same name. So I'll go ahead and click Save and Continue. Start feed processing. This should take just a second. Anyone got any Jeopardy music?
I'll just say this import feature is sick.
Yeah. So this was actually a third-party plugin that Kraft thought was important enough, and they purchased from the vendor and made it completely free, and they support it now. So Kraft also realizes this is an awesome feature. So the feed is finished. I'll go to entries, and there's all the quips from the API. If I open this up, there's the show title, there's the all that imported content directly from the API. So next, let's jump over to a code editor, and I can talk a little bit about the directory structure of Kraft. I'm not going to dive too deep. I have all the code kind of written beforehand. Let's just take like a basic look. So the kind of important pieces here is this web folder is essentially the public directory for your project. So JavaScript, CSS files, they all go in there. Once again, I did what Myke did and just scraped everything from the website and threw it in there. This right here, this Kraft is an executable provided by Kraft. It's a command, like a CLI tool to manage various pieces of Kraft. One of those is actually like a built-in web server, which I'm running already. So there's like a Kraft serve command to start up the project. I'm going to skip over the most of this stuff. The last thing is this templates folder. This contains all of those templates, and these can be Twig files or HTML files. And by default, when you create templates inside this folder that have some kind of like special name, like for instance index here, Kraft will actually route requests directly there. So just by creating an index.twig file, I actually have a home page now, and it will render this template for me. If I had a blog.twig and I went to /blog on my website, it would automatically render that template. These ones with underscores, I'm specifically saying I don't want to use that routing feature, and Kraft is actually handling those requests. It's grabbing data from the database to actually hit these individual, and then loads these templates to render them. So let's start with the index.twig. Kind of like how Myke showed the Umbraco layouts. Most of these inherit from kind of a base template. The same thing where it has all of the main HTML structure, the navigation, the footer, that kind of thing. And then we inject the content into a specific section there using this block tag. If I scroll down just a little bit, this is kind of the first interesting piece of code. So let's load up the homepage really quick. So we have, instead of most recent quips, since the API doesn't actually have like the date these were posted, instead I'm sorting them by most popular. So these are the most viewed quips according to the API. And the query to go grab this data out of Kraft is actually right here in the template. It's a really simple query. So first of all, this set tag is a special tag in Twig to create a brand new variable. It's something lots of other templating languages don't have, which is really awesome that Twig does. And then it uses this global variable that is available in any Twig template called Kraft. And this is how you access all of the Kraft APIs. So what we're doing here is creating a new entries query by calling this .entries method. So we're searching for entries, not assets or categories. Those are some other kind of built-in types. And then we're limiting this query to the section called quips. And right here, this is where that field handle comes in. So this string here matches the section handle back when I was creating it. And then I do a order by, and I'm actually specifying a field on those entry types that come back. So this is the views field, and it's ordering by those, and then I'm limiting them to just 20, and then this .all is a method that actually executes the query. So you could like have some conditionals to build up your query and then execute it right at the end. And then lastly, looping through all of these and using kind of a partial, if you will, I call it a component called QuipCard that just spits out all of the data in the markup. And then last is the quip detail. And kind of the interesting piece about this is whenever Kraft finds an entry in the database and then it is responsible for rendering the template, it provides a global variable in that template called entry, which is equal to kind of the model from Umbraco's example, the entry that it found. And so here I am retrieving the video and the image, and then dynamically spitting those out into the markup if they exist. If not, falling back to the imported field. And then also on the detail page, I don't think I'm getting sound. It's pulling in other quips related to the specific show. And the query to do that is also pretty simple. Although we don't have like a true relationship set up with shows, because I didn't go create like a shows section or anything like that, the QuipVid API makes sure that the show titles match completely, and so you can match against those. So right here, I'm kind of doing a similar query on the home page. I'm setting a related variable equal to craft.entries.section quips, and then there's this specific search function where you can this is used for search pages, most likely, but you can also do much more granular searches. So this right here is basically saying if the show title is equal to only the current entry's show title, bring back those. And the tildes here represent string concatenation. It's a very weird symbol to do that, but whatever. And then the last line here is this ID method, which specifically excludes the current entry's ID from the query so that we don't get the quip reviewing in the related quips at the bottom. And then just the same thing, looping through all of these and spitting out the markup for it. Okay, hopefully that was close to time. Is there any questions? Okay, I'll let WordPress handle it.
Sincere apologies for the inappropriate content of some of these quips.
All right, some of you guys have heard of WordPress before. Yeah. So what's how many of you guys think WordPress is pretty all right? How many of you guys think it's not the best, but it's not great? And how many of you guys think it's just garbage? And okay, cool. I'll allow it. All right. So first things first, I want to say yes. Oh, spoiler. So first things first, I want to say yes. There is a lot to hate about WordPress. If you like elegant, well-structured coding and organizing all your data types and all this is absolutely not for you. It is, as you probably know, it started out as a blog engine, and then it just got stuff piled onto it over time, and now it's just this huge thing. Fortunately, there are a lot of talented developers behind it and people doing good stuff with it and developing all kinds of tools for it. So if you know what you're doing, it's great. And so first and foremost, I'll say the best thing about WordPress is its community. It powers 3.8 billion site. No, I just made that up. It powers a lot of websites on the internet, like more than any other CMS. And as a result, it has, I'm pulling my notes, it has just a thriving community around it. And again, kind of another, there's going to be a lot of this in this talk, is that WordPress is, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, all the good things about it are also bad things. So it has a huge plugin repository, just obscenely huge. And it's full of garbage, but it's also full of just really useful stuff. So for example, you already saw I did the import thing, and I was talking to Levi before we started, and he's like, oh yeah, I have an ace up my sleeve, it's this import. I was like, oh, that's a good idea. So I went out and grabbed a plugin I've used before, and I was able to do it too. Yeah, so let's start at a high level though, talking about what it is. So this is the back end of WordPress. There's a few concepts we're going to have to lay out to kind of understand what we're talking about here. The main things we want to know are themes. So like whenever you develop a WordPress site, you're pretty much just developing a theme. And then, like I said, there's plugins which provide functionality into your WordPress install, which is the core itself. And then, unlike Kraft, it is kind of opinionated. It comes with a post type and a pages post type, and comments are kind of a function. But anyway, it does make a few assumptions, and again, that's just something you got to deal with. Guess what? There's a plugin to quickly control what is and is not shown in the admin. So if you have an end user, you can get rid of all the cruft so they don't deal with it, or you can just write the code yourself in your theme, and then it'll go away. In terms of routing, so this, you kind of mentioned if you name your file index.php, it knows that's your homepage. That is pretty much the main way that WordPress gets around. So this is, whenever you load a page in WordPress, this is the logic it goes through to figure out which template file to use. I'll make it a little bigger. So here's all the source PHP files inside of your theme. And it says, okay, well, what am I looking at? Is this an archive? Is this a list of entries? They're called posts in WordPress, but in Kraft they would be entries, which is also confusing because there's a post type, which is for blog posts, and they call it posts. But if you make any sort of entry, it's called a post. So when I say post, I'm talking about an entry. If it's an archive of posts, it's well, actually, what kind of archive is this? Is it an archive based on author, on category? A date, whatever. Is it a singular page? Well, is it a static page, or is it a single instance of a post page? So this is another piece of legacy crap. Is there's a lot of post and page specific stuff still built into the core, even though they're basically just another post type. So you got to get around that. And actually, I'm going to back up. I'd say if there's one thing to take away from this, it's that WordPress has a huge community and it's great and can do awesome things, but it's only going to be as awesome as you are in terms of how you know how to navigate its quirks. Once you understand how it works and what it can do, you can make it do pretty much anything, and it's pretty great. It's definitely bloated. It definitely does not have great performance, but it's 2019, and you can solve all those problems on another layer of the stack. I mean, with a CDN and a good host that uses caching, there's plugins that'll auto concatenate all of your plugin stuff and your themes stuff. It'll minify. It'll do all this for you. But again, it's just hell to navigate all this stuff and figure out what you need to configure and where it's configured and all that. But once you get it, you'll love it. So anyway, that's routing, and that's probably one of the biggest confusions, I think. So also, this is up on a repo. I'll put a link. It's SGF Web Devs WP is not as bad as you probably think. Is the name of the repo. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's dive in here. So this is my whole repository. You see these 3 folders, and pretty much all these files are part of the core that you download. And again, almost all the work you do is going to be adding plugins, and then of course developing your theme. So I started a new theme called QuickVid, and again, just because WordPress is weird, you define your theme with a CSS comment. This is basically the equivalent of XML to structure what you're saying. So that's where you define it. Once it's defined there, on the back side, you'll have appearances theme. It'll show up here as something to pick from, and you can say yes. I uninstalled all the default themes it comes with. But anyway, so now I'm in this theme. Within my theme, there's just a few files I've added, and I'll also give this caveat. This is oh hey, you just say something. I'll make it better contrast. Yeah. Is that better? Cool. So see, that's where you define your theme, and you can see that it just pulls these values out. It parses your CSS file, looks for these colons, I guess. I don't know, it's weird. Anyway, so I built this just bare minimum. There's WordPress is not. There's some parts of it that are going to give you very specific markup, but you can write whatever you want. There is a Twig plugin to let you write Twig if you want to do that. There's literally anything you want pretty much exists for WordPress. You just got to vet the developer and vet the quality of the code and all that. But anyway, I got my theme set up, and the rest of this is basically, most of this is here for routing. So my single quip, you'll see that if I'm hitting a single page, I'm hitting a singular page, a single single post page. It is a custom post. So single dash post type is going to be the format. Yeah, here it is. Single dash post type is going to be what I name my file, and WordPress is going to know to use this file. So in here, I call get header, just some function called get header, and that is going to load in my header partial, which has the header of the website. And you'll see there's a few other things in here, like I can get the title of the page I'm on. WP head's going to inject a bunch of stuff. I got my body class. I'll get into the other stuff later. I have my front page. If you name it front dash page, it says, oh, that's going to be the front page of your website. Here it is, site front page. It looks and sees if this is there. If it's not there, it's going to keep going down the track until it finds some file to use. And eventually it all ends up at index.php to handle whatever's not handled with a specific file type or file name. So anyway, then I have all my stuff that appears on this particular page. Then I have my get footer, which does the same thing and pulls in the footer. And again, there's this WP footer function, which is going to inject a bunch of stuff. So now, one thing about WordPress too is it's if you love spaghetti, you're going to love WordPress because it uses hooks and filters to do pretty much everything. So a hook and a filter. So make this a little bigger. So a lot of this is what's going on in core. So like as it bootstraps itself and loads up everything, along the way you'll see these do action this thing, do action that thing, do action this thing, do action init. That's a big one. So along the way, as it's like executing stuff, it's like, oh yeah, do this action, and then plugin developers and theme developers can say, oh, when it's time for that action, run this piece of code for me, please. And you just like inject whatever you need to happen wherever it is in the process. And again, it's like, it's pretty powerful, but it's so disorganized, and it's just, and it's not what you would expect. But again, once you kind of start to familiarize yourself with hooks and which ones to look for, and you know that, oh, that hook exists, so I could just hook into that and change stuff. So we'll get into that in a minute. Here's a bunch of other stuff here's basically all the stuff that gets run in order. And then, so that's an action. That would be a hook. A filter is like the same thing, but for data. So for example, whenever you're loading the content of a website, you just call this function called the content, and it parses out the main content of the page you're on. But before it returns it, it'll run it through a filter you make. So you can do like a search and replace in it. You can wrap it in something. You could replace it, and you could throw it all out and just return a hard-coded string as the content. You could do whatever you want with it. And again, this is like really powerful, but it's also very fragile because like anybody who develops anything can hook into anything. So let's look at how we've used that in this code. So we'll start with the front page. So I have the header. I call in my header. I call this the post function, which basically sets up a bunch of variables invisibly. And it makes a lot of other functions work. And it's a weird concept. We'll talk about that more when we get to the loop, which is another big concept. So here I'm calling the content, and let's actually look at the other side of this page. So I've set this quip vid page as my front page. So this is the Gutenberg Editor. This just came out in WordPress 5. There's a lot of hate for it. The most popular plugin on WordPress right now is Classic Editor, which just basically removes this and lets you use it. It actually kind of reminds me of what we were looking at with AEM, where it just has these blocks and you can you edit them one by one and you can kind of stack them up and all that. But there's a lot. We don't need to get into it. But anyway, I kept it for this because I didn't need to do much. So whenever I call the content, it's going to return me all this stuff. That's really all you need to know. And then I have my latest quips, and here's where it starts getting juicy. So we have this concept called a WP query, which is how you query data out of the database. And you have a bunch of arguments you pass into it just in the form of an anonymous array. So you say my post type is going to be a quip. Oh my god, I skipped post types and taxonomies. Man, this is hard. 15 minutes. Okay. So the other big concept here is post types and taxonomy. So we talked about posts, we talked about pages, and quips. These are all types of entries, just like we were looking at again in Kraft. just like this, there's also taxonomies, which can be categories. So like with posts, you get categories and tags. These are each taxonomies. They're basically like groupings of things. And the reason you would do that versus some direct is it's mostly just because like WordPress is there to handle that sort of in terms of the way the database is set up and all that. It'll just perform better if you use tags and those kind of things for grouping, and then single entries is these. So anyway, I'm using my post type quip, which I registered. I'll show you that real quick. So I just included these files. Sorry, last thing. With a theme, you have a functions.php file, which is a special file that along the way in that initial WordPress load, somewhere along here, setup theme, I think, yeah, you can see here's where it includes functions.php. So any code you put in here is going to be executed. So I like to define a constant, and I just keep this in here, and this I use for cache busting. And then just for organizational purposes, I've broken out some of my other functions into other files, again, just arbitrarily, and I'm just requiring them here. Here's a good action of in queue scripts where I can say I need to register these JavaScript files. There's actually a separate one for CSS, but I went ahead and put them all here. They all get spit out in the head anyway. I include the style CSS, then I include a font awesome from a CDN. Yeah, so that's where I've done all that, and you can see I've registered, instead of using a GUI, I just register my post type with this register post type function. So I set up all my labels for things, which just gets passed into the args for all this other stuff. So it can be public, it can be behind the scenes, you can change the slug. You can say, yes, it has an archive, a list view, no, it doesn't. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff you can customize. But anyway, that's how you create that quip, which is what gave me this over here. And it's what I'm going to query on the front page. So if you'll recall, the front page of the website looks like this. I just have latest quips showing up here. So pop back to here. Here's my query. I'm going to say, give me quips. Give me the 12 of them. So this also supports pagination, all kinds of crazy stuff. But I'm just defaulting to one page. Give me 12 per page, ordered by date, descending. Cool. And then it's going to store the results basically in this variable here. Now, I probably could have done this a little more elegantly, but I think it's fine. This get template part is a function that basically it's just a way for you to include PHP files elsewhere. And in this case, it's going to look in partials-quip list, which is right here. And so this is my partial of anytime we have this list view. I'm gonna call this. So I made a note that you need to set up this variable before you use this. So this is my query I just set up on the home page. And then I check, okay, do I have posts returning? No quips, bro. If I do have them, then we're going to loop over them. And so each time it goes through this loop, it's going to move on to the next post. And then when we call the post, it's going to be like, boom, this is our post now. So when I say get field, it knows which post I'm referring to. Because again, there's just a lot of these random functions that aren't really, methods tied to some class or anything. And then I have my tile. I can call the permalink to echo out the permalink for the post I'm currently working with. I also call this get field thumbnail, and I'm storing it here. I think I pulled it out for some reason and didn't end up needing to. But anyway, put the thumbnail there, stick the title out here, and then I have this, which is cool. Oh, that would have been great. Anyway. I might be muted. Anyway.
Yeah, Mr. White.
Okay, I'll take it. Cool.
Yeah, science.
So anyway, those link me to my page. Just like I said, I have the single quip, which shows me the single quip, and I don't know that we need to go through all this. I will show you we have a view count. Let me show you the back side of this. So we have on each quip, by default, WordPress, ignore this part. It's going to give me a title. It's going to give me some of this stuff. And actually, this is what I defined here. As I said, supports. Give me a title. Give me page attributes, which is that stuff on the side, and also give me a featured image, which I ended up also not using, but I left it in here. All this stuff over here. This is when I'm going to start leveraging plugins. So there's a must use there's a handful of must-use plugins that I use on almost every site. It's going to be Advanced Custom Fields, which is what gives me the ability to create custom fields, just like, it's going to be that section we were just looking at. I'll jump into that in a sec. Gravity Forms, which is a really handy form builder. Relevancy, which makes WordPress search awesome because it's garbage by default. And then WP All Import Pro, which is what I use to steal Levi's idea. Okay, so anyway, Quip info. This is going to look familiar. I can group these, I can do whatever, but I'm saying I need a thumbnail. The field type is an image, but look at all this other types of content it supports out of the box. Lots of really cool stuff there. I can say I want the image URL when I get it, or I get an array and it gives me a bunch of other data too. For the video source, it's just going to be a file. And then I saw in the code there was place for a transcript, but I didn't really use it, but it's there. Anyway, and then down here I can say these fields, use these fields if the post type is equal to Quip. But you can set up all kinds of logic to say these fields are relevant to all these different spots in the system. I can style it, do all kinds of other stuff. So anyway, that gives me my my stuff there. In addition to custom post types, there's also again taxonomies. So I called it Quip Source, which is what we've been calling title, which is the show or movie title. I say it is applicable to Quip, and then I can give it some other properties as well. None of them are super critical to what we're doing right now. And then with that being done, I basically have all I need. So I talked about it not being too picky on how it spits out stuff. I am using two WordPress functions here. This is a dynamic menu up here. So if I look in my header, you can see I'm just calling WP nav menu global. And then what that does is this allows the end user to build the menu themselves. So they can pick from pages, they can pick from custom post types, all kinds of stuff, and they can just put whatever they want up in the menu, reorganize it, nest it, save it, and then see now it's all up here. I didn't do any styling on it.
Science.
The other thing is search. This search here, I'm using WordPress has a get search form, and it spits it out with some, its own DOM, and so I just, didn't style it. But I did hook it up. So I don't know. What should I search for? Lebowski. So cool. Hate the Eagles.
Man, come on. I had a rough night, and I hate the fucking Eagles, man.
So like I said, I'm using relevancy. So this never would have been caught before because it doesn't say Lebowski in the title, but it does. It probably came up because it has Big Lebowski as the category, and these probably didn't come up because they're not indexed yet. But you can see the same things going on here, where these are all. A lot of F words in this movie. There's a.
Not that one.
Ooh, not this one, yeah.
You see what happens, Larry? You see what happens when you find a stranger in the Alps?
Yeah. Cool. So anyway, I'm able to do again because I'm using the built-in stuff. I can use nice things like. Here's where I'm echoing all my different fields, getting the title, transcript, etc. But for my query for this, I do the same thing. I say my post type is Quip. I want 12. Again, I'm going to exclude the current post by passing in an array that only contains the ID of the post I'm on. But then I have this tax query where I can basically query based on a taxonomy. So I say my taxonomy is Quip source, and my terms are the source term, which I set up here. So this just gets all the terms associated with the current post. Again, post is like this global variable that's just, you got to know it's there and it's special. It's weird. And then I'm just popping off the first one since you only have one for each of them. View count, I'm doing the same thing. I'm getting the view count and adding one, and then I'm manually updating that count. The rest is pretty much the same. Last things I'll show you are, again, my plugins. Relevancy is awesome. Algolia has a out of the box plugin that'll just like straight up make it work. You just install it, configure it, and then have Algolia search for your whole website. There's all kinds of stuff. Like, I cannot stress enough how awesome the plugins are if you vet them and like kind of know what you're doing. The last one is Gravity Forms. It's cool. Drag and drop. You'll love it. WPL import. So just because I got a one-up Levi, this one's entirely visual. So like, yeah. So I have it over here, and I can drag. I just drag over the piece that I want to show up somewhere. So like, yeah, super awesome. See. Anyway, you drag it over. There's a bunch of add-ons for it. So like in my case, I didn't have to just, even though you get URLs, this plugin will actually import it into your media library for you. So it grabs the URL, it downloads it, sticks it in the media library, and then links it in your post for you. So it's like, it's all ready to go. It can assign tags and everything. So it's super helpful there. They also have an all export, which moves it the other direction. It's pretty exciting stuff. I think that's probably the high-level stuff for now. Like I said, if you know how to wield it, it's great. You got to take the good with the bad. Once you accept the dual nature of existence, you'll love it. So that's all. All right.
I have one question on WordPress.
Yeah.
How do I move it to another domain?
Better search and replace, and or like 5 other places.
Yeah, still the story today.
Yeah, it's better than it's been. I mean, yeah, it's still quirky in how it expects it there to be on a certain domain, but
I've never
there's lots of
understood
ways around it.
why. Do you know why it is that they have not changed that over all these years?
It's just baked in. Like, they store links in the database, and like there's a bunch of stuff like that that kind of gets hard coded without structure behind it. So you can't really replace it.
Okay. Thanks for sticking it out for a